Good evening, Lake Cities. Glad you're here for our next installment of Words with Friends. Tonight we are going to be talking about joy, but first I wanted to start with a question about a different emotion that is often paired with joy, which is happiness. So what brings about happiness?
Happiness for me is more about circumstances. I'm sorry, I happen to know that happiness is rooted in happenstance, which is just kind of luck. But the fact that things are going well makes me happy. So if I'm catching fish while I'm fishing, if I have a great meal, if we get to spend time with our family, I'm happy.
I'll just say specifically today, the weather outside makes me happy. And that it's the first day of fall and it's cool outside makes me extremely happy. But on the first day of fall any other year, it could be 95 degrees and I wouldn't be as happy. So that's an example of why happiness is a little bit different.
Happiness has a lot to do with outcomes.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, in our own Declaration of Independence, and I know you guys just read this, the pursuit of happiness is to be said to be one of our unalienable rights as people. So what do you think that means? What does the pursuit of happiness mean for you?
Ooh. Go ahead, Leah. I'm going to let you take this one.
I think for a lot of people, it means a selfish pursuit of happiness. That I'm going to do whatever it takes to make myself happy and forget about everybody else involved. And I think that's where we get into trouble, especially as Christians, because should not be focused on ourselves. We should be focused on others. And when we think about the pursuit of happiness for ourselves, it gets in the way of that mindset completely.
A more American approach might also be right to the family. Like, I'm going to do what I have to do to provide for my kids. I'm going to do what I have to do so that they can go to college. And the pursuit of their happiness, or what we see as happiness, becomes very wrapped up in how well we're doing financially, how well they might do in school, how well they might do at Little League. But again, it's bound to outcomes, and pursuing that is this idea of pursuing that quote unquote American dream, where everybody's good looking and you're on a motorboat water skiing, because that's it. It's
So Leah kind of just touched on this a little bit, but how can really that pursuit of happiness lead to corruption really in our own lives?
Well, I think if you're not careful, you're gonna wind up getting all of these things that you thought you wanted, and then realize you don't want any of the things that you got, because you thought happiness was here, and once you arrive there, you say, "Oh, it was all the things that I missed." So I spent all this time at work, and I missed all this time with my kids. I spent all this time pressing down into fitness, whatever you want to put, and then you realize what you lost along the way. And so I think you have to make sure that the journey to where you're going is as enjoyable as the destination, if that makes sense.
Yes. I think a lot of times, especially when we're in pursuit of things, once we finally do have that thing, we find the happiness that's associated with it to be hollow. It's momentary. And then we're on to the next thing.
It's gaining the world and forfeiting your very soul.
Yes.
And you're supposed to reverse that if you kind of guard your soul and pursue those things, then the others are added to it. And we mix those up.
Right. Yeah. So that was just a quick couple of questions on happiness. We're going to watch the video and then we'll talk about joy after that.
Being in a good mood is really great, and most languages have lots of words to describe the experience, like happy, cheerful, joyful, and so on. The same goes for the languages of the Bible. In ancient biblical Hebrew, there's a variety of words, like simcha, sason, or gil. In the Greek New Testament, there's kara, euphrosune, or agaliasis. Each word has its own unique nuance, but they all basically refer to the feeling of joy and happiness. Now, what makes these biblical joy words interesting is noticing the kinds of things that bring happiness, and also seeing how joy is a key theme that runs through the whole story of the Bible. Let's start with sources of joy. On page 1 of the Bible, God says that this world is very good. And so naturally, people find joy in beautiful and good things of life, like growing flocks or an abundant harvest on the hills. The poet of Psalm 104 says, "A good bottle of wine is God's gift to bring joy to people's hearts." People find joy at a wedding or in their children. There's even a Hebrew proverb that compares the joy that perfume brings to your nose with the joy a good friend brings to your heart. However, human history isn't just a joy fest. The biblical story shows how we live in a world that's been corrupted by our own selfishness. It's marked by death and loss. And this is where biblical faith offers a unique perspective on joy. It's an attitude God's people adopt, not because of happy circumstances, but because of their hope in God's love and promise. So when the Israelites were suffering from slavery in Egypt, God raised up Moses to lead them into freedom. And the first thing the Israelites did was sing for joy. Even though they were in the middle of a desert, they were vulnerable, the promised land was still far away, they rejoiced anyway. Later biblical poets looked back on this story and they remembered how the Lord caused his people to leave with joy, his chosen ones with shouts of joy. This joy in the wilderness, this was a defining moment, a way of saying that the joy of God's people is not determined by their struggles, but by their future destiny. This theme appears later in Israel's story, when Israel suffered under the oppression of foreign empires. The prophet Isaiah looked for a day when God would raise up a new deliverer like Moses. That's when those redeemed by the Lord will return to Zion with glad shouts, with eternal joy crowning their heads. Happiness and joy will overtake them. And while the Israelites waited, they chose joy to anticipate their future redemption. This is why it's significant that when Jesus of Nazareth was born, it was announced as good news that brings great joy. We're told that Jesus himself rejoiced and gave thanks to God his Father when he began to announce the kingdom of God. He even taught his followers the same joy in the wilderness, saying, "When people reject you or persecute you for following me, rejoice, be very glad, because your reward is great in heaven." After his death and resurrection, Jesus commissioned his followers to go out and announce the good news that he was the risen King of the world. And as they did so, the early Christian communities were known for being full of joy, even when they were persecuted. Like when the Apostle Paul was sitting in a dirty Roman prison, he could say that he's chosen joy, even if he gets executed. He called this the joy of faith, or joy in the Lord. He believed it was the gift of God's Spirit, a sign that Jesus' presence is with you, inspiring hope in the midst of hardship. And when you believe that Jesus' love has overcome death itself, joy becomes reasonable in the darkest of circumstances. Now, this doesn't mean that you ignore or suppress your sorrow. That's not healthy or necessary. Paul often expressed his grief about missing loved ones or losing friends or his own freedom. He called it being full of sorrow and yet rejoicing. As he acknowledged his pain, he also made a choice to trust Jesus, that his loss wouldn't be the final word. This is very different from the trite advice to turn that frown upside down. Christian joy is a profound decision of faith and hope in the power of Jesus' own life and love. And that's what biblical joy is all about.
I hope you enjoyed that video. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about joy. So what were some of the things discussed in that video that brought about joy?
Growing harvests, children, being with friends.
Yeah.
I think things that are more lasting, things that are have more permanence.
Right.
Not just not attached to a certain date or a time, but a season.
Right. Yeah. So in the video, joy was described as an attitude God's people adopt, not because of a happy circumstance like we talked about earlier, but because of their hope in God's love and promise. So we talked about hope last week, and so it really ties into our theme of joy this week. So we kind of touched on it. How would you say joy and happiness really differ from a core core stance?
Well, if hope is that tension, remember from last week, is the cord that's stretched, then we learned that no matter what happens, not just even if, but even though, it's an even though response to the world. There's a great passage in Habakkuk that says, even though the crops have failed, even though the vineyards don't produce, still I'm going to praise God. That's joy. It's not even just saying, oh, well, if bad things happen. It's saying even when they happen. So it's more of a choice.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love the connection, because last week we really hit home that hope is a choice. because of our hope in God, because of our relationship with Him. And joy is the same way. Even if everything is going wrong, we should have joy because we know God is going to get us through it.
Right.
And He's going to teach us lessons because of those circumstances.
But I've quoted her before, but my friend Beverly Ross says that joy and grief can hold hands, that they can walk together, that even in your darkest moments of loss, you can experience joy. And that, if you were saying, I'm so happy, then you'd go, well, that's a problem. Like, we need to
Yeah.
get that diagnosed
Right.
and worked out. But if you're saying, no, I'm joyful in the middle of this because I have perspective, or I can see the long-term nature of this suffering, that's way more healthy.
Yes.
Yeah, and that kind of, my next question was going to be, do you have to be happy to experience joy? Because I
Yeah.
think we often see happiness and we go, well, this is what joy feels like. And this is what joy can only feel like, is
Right.
when I'm actually in a good mood and happy. But we see in Philippians 1:25, when Paul's writing, convinced of this, that I know I will remain, talking about being in prison, and I will continue for all of you in your progress and joy in the faith. We see it in James 1 verse 2. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, wherever you face trials of many kinds. And then again in 2 Corinthians 6, sorrowful yet always rejoicing, poor yet making many rich, having nothing and yet possessing everything.
Or joyful in hope, patient in affliction.
Yeah.
That we realize that these things are going to happen together. Well, I would say that that joyfulness and happiness sound alike. That a lot of those emotions look similar, but they're really not the same thing. And you can experience a joy in sorrow.
Yeah.
You can experience joy in grief. You can experience joy in hard times, but you wouldn't call that. I wasn't happy about that.
Yeah.
Right.
But in hindsight, I'm glad that I went through that. It produced something.
Yeah. Yeah, and so closing out tonight, at the very end of that video, it says Christian joy is a profound decision of faith and hope. So that joy is kind of the equation that comes from faith and hope. And so the question I want to leave with you, and I'll leave with you guys, is what are some areas in your life where you need to be choosing joy, right? You walk into a situation, you know it's difficult, but we need to choose joy better. What do you think some of those are?
I think it's difficult to choose joy in waiting, in the in-between times, especially right now. We're very much in a state of transition, and it's hard to find the joy in that, in when will this be over? But finding that joy and knowing that there will be an end to this is the key to getting us through it.
It's that phrase that we find in the Psalms, how long, O Lord? How long? It's choosing joy in the times of lament. And when you're just like, this is not right. And realizing that the only time that everything is going to be set right and fulfilled and redeemed is at the end of time. And with that perspective, I have to choose joy in, like you say, in the in-between time. That we might solve one problem for a season, but there's always going to be hurt. There's always going to be poverty. There's always going to be loss. And so in those really difficult times, I would say that's when I have to make a choice to be joyful.
Right. So we hope that you guys discuss that amongst yourselves at home, and we will see you next week for a continuation of our Words with Friends. God bless.